I just want to let you know, this is only happening because of my wife, Yael. I mean, we're only here because Yael said it was okay. And for years, by the way, I've been hearing about Reverend Cornell Brooks. It was like she would talk about him in the car. We would be listening to something, and she'd be like, Cornell Brooks says. And I'd be like, oh, okay. And she says, I met with Cornell Brooks last week, and he said. And then she'd be like, what Cornell Brooks thinks about this. And I'm like, honey, just come out and say it that you feel like my resume is lacking and that I need to do more. Because Reverend Cornell Brooks is a professor at Harvard, a graduate of Yale Law School, the former director of the NAACP, a voting rights and civil rights expert, and he also happens to be a fourth-generation ordained minister. And it's true, I still have some work to do. But we're so happy to welcome you here, Cornell, and also your wife, Janice Broom Brooks. I know that you and your two sons live just over the line in Virginia for quite a while now, but that you're going back and forth all the time. I spoke to your assistant, and she said most of the other professors at the Kennedy School have an assistant that they share with other people, but Cornell only gets one because he's so busy that nobody else can keep up with him. We want to thank you for your devotion to voting rights. We want to thank you for your devotion to civil rights. And especially we want to thank you for being here this morning to teach us about the words and the legacy of Dr. King and the way that it affects this moment. Everyone, I introduce to you Reverend Cornell Brooks.
Shabbat shalom. To Rabbi Scott Perlow, and I believe there's a special Hebrew term for the wife of the rabbi. And I proudly memorized it, spoke to Yael just before the service and realized I was mispronouncing it. And to the wife of the rabbi, who is a very, very serious attorney. And to their wonderful sons, who I hear Yael speak of so rhapsodically. And to this wonderful, extraordinary congregation. To the wonderful woman whose memory we honor with this service, and to all of you, I'm so delighted, so honored, so humbled to be here. Now, because your rabbi has such a wonderful sense of humor, you won't consider it robbery for me to tell at least two stories before I begin. I have a special relationship with Jewish clergy. As you know, I'm a fourth-generation ordained minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, America's first African-American denomination. But when I was born at Fort Bliss in General William Beaumont Hospital, I was born 3 pounds and 3 ounces. The physician said to my mother that if you're religious, you should have someone bless your son because he's not likely to live beyond the end of the day. So they looked for a Protestant chaplain, couldn't find one. Looked for a priest, couldn't find one. But they did find a rabbi. And I'm not sure by what interfaith ecumenical process, but he baptized me. I'm not sure if in the Reformed, Reconstructionist, Conservative, or Orthodox tradition, if this is in fact legal. But my grandmother, a staunch African Methodist, told me this story as a little boy because she reminded me, because of the prayers of that rabbi and the prayers of my Methodist grandmother, I am here today. So before I met any ministers, I met a rabbi. Thank you. Now, to this wonderful congregation, I have to let you know I am very honored to be here. And I have to also let you know that I've not always been so fortunate in the course of my ministry to preach, to speak, to share with such a distinguished group of people. In fact, early in my ministry, true story, I found myself in London, England, on a Sunday morning, standing outside of this beautiful Gothic cathedral, anticipating the opportunity to preach. So I'm standing outside of this beautiful Gothic cathedral with spires soaring up toward the heavens, stained glass windows reflecting the iridescent, multicolored, multi-hued beauty and majesty of God. As a young, innocent, naive preacher, I assumed that there were about 2,000 or so people inside waiting to hear this young, naive, presumptuous preacher preach. I made my way into the sanctuary, and Rabbi, I immediately noticed the obvious: the pastor and exactly 2 members. But I did as I was taught to do, which is to say that you preach, you share, you speak to 2 people in the same way that you would to 2,000. So I made my way to the pulpit and I began to preach, and I noticed that one member I'll call Miss Smith immediately fell asleep. True story. But I noticed that Miss Jones, the other member, seemed to hang on to every word I had to say. She said amen at all the right liturgical moments. She said hallelujah at all the right theological and scriptural moments. And I thought to myself, at least I'm reaching one somebody this Sunday morning. I concluded my homily, made my way to the side of the pastor, and the pastor said to me, "Brother Brooks, I'm just so sorry. Miss Smith falls asleep on everybody, and Miss Jones is out of her mind and did not understand the thing you had to say." True story. So you can see why I'm so delighted to be in the midst of such a distinguished congregation, wide awake and presumably all in your right minds. We find ourselves on this day at a morally poignant, politically perilous, God-sustained moment in history. And yet this is no ordinary time. We find ourselves as we approach the end of Shabbat at 5:57 p.m. today, on the eve of the inauguration of a president and the federal birthday celebration of a king. This is no ordinary time. We find ourselves amidst the mind-rattling juxtaposition of the inauguration of the first president since World War II who enters office with a negative approval rating, and the celebration of a global minister who is deeply and widely respected around the globe. It is no ordinary time. We find ourselves at a moment on the eve of the inauguration of a president and the holiday celebration of a minister. This contrast in occasions provides a moment for a kind of disquieting feeling in the heart. It is no ordinary time. We find ourselves in a moment in which young scholars and elderly children of the Holocaust and students of the philosophy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King wonder aloud, how do we find ourselves on the razor's edge of a precipice of authoritarianism, even as we contemplate the possibilities of the promised land? This is no ordinary time. Having come through an election season in which we have seen anti-Semitism normalized on the left, on the right, and in the center. We have seen racism routinized, Islamophobia de-exceptionalized, and misogyny mainstream. And all across the country, there are those who yet lament, in the words of Shakespeare, now is the winter of our discontent. This is no ordinary time. We find ourselves in a moment in which we recall the words of a first lady and a former member of the board of directors of the NAACP by the name of Eleanor Roosevelt, who in 1940, when the flames of anti-Semitism and authoritarianism were raging across Europe, and the tall shadow of Jim Crow literally cast its darkness across the length of this land. In that moment, in 1940, Eleanor Roosevelt said, "This is no ordinary time." Yet here, in this place, we know this is no random moment on the Gregorian calendar. This is no random moment on the Hebrew calendar, a calendar crafted by God who sits high and looks low. We know that this is no random moment. We're not here by happenstance. We're not here by coincidence. We're not here as a matter of accident. We are here because we chose to be here, and God has called us to be here. So we are in a place surrounded by Torah and teaching, surrounded by God's people under the power of His Spirit. And even in this moment where so many are trepidatious, so many are anxious, so many are fearful, we are in God's house, protected and empowered. And so this is no ordinary time. And yet, we as God's people turn day in and day out, Sabbath in and Sabbath out, Shabbat in and Shabbat out. We turn to Scripture. We turn to God's Word. And I have to say, as a lawyer, a minister, a former CEO of the NAACP, I think I have a special love for Torah because I had the opportunity to walk, to march with 200 rabbis from the birthplace of the Voting Rights Act, Selma, Alabama, to the seat of our democracy, a distance of 1,000 miles. And as those lawyers and preachers and 200 rabbis marched from Selma to Washington, D.C. We carried a Torah every mile of the way, every step of the way, every hour of the way. And I became convinced that there's power in the Torah. There's power in the Bible. There's power in the midst of God's people. And so I come to this place. I come in this hour knowing that when I feel weak, knowing when I feel fearful, knowing when I feel anxious, I can turn to this book and find power. And so I look to the book of Numbers, and I hear a story about a group of people. They didn't call themselves African Americans. They didn't necessarily call themselves Africans, but we know that there were Jewish people all over the world. It's a story about a group of people called the Israelites. And I have to tell you, Rabbi, that I find a certain comfort in this story. You see, because my great granddaddy, Jack Wineglass, from the low country of South Carolina, he was one of those people who believed in the Exodus story. He believed in this deliverance story. And so I come to the book of Numbers today excited, because in the book of Numbers we find this story that speaks to us. The Lord said to Moses, "Send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I'm giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe, send one of its leaders." So at the Lord's command, Moses sent them out from the desert of Paran. All of them were leaders of the Israelites, and at the end of 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole of the Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly, showing them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account: "We went into the land to which you sent us. It does flow with milk and honey. Here is the fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites live in the hill country. The Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan." Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack these people. They are stronger than we are." And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land that they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. And all the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we look the same to them." This may seem like a unsettling passage of Torah, pericope from the Bible. A lot of people may grow anxious about this text. But may I suggest to you that this is not just about military conquest and geography. This is about people coming into God's promise. And if you could read this text with the hermeneutic of black enslaved people in this country, who, when we, in my church, Rabbi, when enslaved black people left the South, even the North, and built AME churches in Canada prior to the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 and the 13th Amendment freeing the slaves in 1865, even when our people fled to Canada and we called Canada the Promised Land, the slave catchers chased our people across the border and literally pulled our people out of churches to return them to the Egypt land of bondage. So the Promised Land can't just be about only a place. The Promised Land has got to be bigger than just a place. And so I come to the text this morning knowing that there's somebody in this congregation who yet waits, lives on the eve, on the edge of God's promise. Somebody here has felt a moment of anxiety over the last few weeks. Somebody here has experienced profound grief over the last year. Somebody here knows what it's like to grapple with sorrow even as you cling to hope. And so when we read this text, it speaks to us now. One of the things I'm fascinated by as a Christian minister is that Passover is in the present tense. You know, as the Christians, we read the old story and it speaks to us now. But when we observe the Passover, it's in the present tense. It's told in the present tense. Children are at the table celebrating Passover as a now, not a not then or back then. And so I come to this text this morning on the eve of Martin Luther King's celebration, looking for the ways in which it speaks to us now. We understand as Jews and black people, and the many people who are black and Jewish, that this text speaks to a people who find themselves in a kind of existential calamity, having escaped the bondage of Egypt, spending less than 2 years in the wilderness at the time in which these events occurred, and they are on the edge of the Promised Land. Taylor Branch, a biographer of Martin Luther King, called it being on Canaan's edge. And I have to believe that black people and Jewish people and people who are black and Jewish read this text in a certain way. So in other words, where you have a people who have fled pogroms and prosecution, discrimination and disrespect in every corner of the globe, you read this text in a certain way. When you have a people who were enslaved from 1619 at the very least, although we were brought here in the late 1500s, and who survived slavery at the point at which the 13th Amendment was ratified. There were 3.9 million people who were enslaved, and neo-slavery, the slavery of the black codes, extended into the first week, at least legally speaking, Attorney Bromberg, at least legally speaking, debt slavery, peonage lasted until the first week of World War II. So 1 million people enslaved in the last century. And so we come to this text, unlike most people in the world, we come to this text with an anxiousness about what it will give us, how it speaks to us. And so this text speaks to a group of people who are on Canaan's edge. They send a group of scouts into the promised land. And they send them into the promised land to assess how well the cities are fortified, to what degree are the people numerous and populous and powerful, and to what degree is the land fruitful. They were looking for a military report, perhaps a demographic report, also an agricultural report. And so I want to suggest to you at the first lesson of this text is that we are in a moment where we need accurate analysis. We need assessment. We as God's people are literally on the edge of the promised land, and we need clear thinking. We need rich analysis. We need data. Now, I've been told by your rabbi that this is an exceptionally learned congregation. So this will come, if it was a lie, he told it. That this is an exceptionally learned, erudite congregation. And so analysis is important. We're reminded that Martin Luther King was an extraordinary homiletician, an extraordinary rhetorician, an extraordinary preacher of prodigious ability. And yet we understand that he also attended Morehouse College at the age of 15. We also understand that he gained a PhD in systematic theology at Boston University. You understand that he went to Boston University, declining the doctoral degrees at the University of Pennsylvania and Edinburgh because Boston University was the home of a school of moral philosophy called Boston Personalism, a school of philosophy that essentially held that God is a person, and that God cares about people, and that God so cares about people, he has endowed every person, every human being, every child with innate, undeniable worth and value. The Boston Personalists ripped off the Jewish people. The Christians added insult to injury because we call the concept imago Dei. Dr. King went to Boston University, was a brilliant student. When you read Stride Toward Freedom, when you read The Trumpet of Conscience, when you read Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, when you read the Mountaintop speech, when you read the I Have a Dream speech, when you read the hundreds of essays and sermons that he wrote over the course of his lifetime, his brilliance bursts forth. There's analysis there. You understand that when you read his books, that they are sociological excursions. And so I want to simply suggest to you in this moment, we cannot merely listen to Dr. King. We must be literate with respect to Dr. King. Oh, may I tell you a little story? It's embarrassing, and I ask that you extend to me some confidentiality. When I was a young man, first-year student at Jackson State University, I went there on a full academic scholarship, and I thought that I was a scholar in the making. Foolish and presumptuous thought. I found myself in a room not unlike this room. And in that room, or at the beginning of the top of the room, at the front of the room, was a speaker who asked 3 questions. The first question he asked was, how many of you believe in God? This being the Deep South, as in Mississippi, everybody raised their hand whether or not that was true. This doesn't happen at Adat Shalom, but you know, Rabbi, we got people in the AME church who say they believe but don't really believe. But in that room, everyone raised their hand, and then the speaker asked the question, how many of you have read the Bible from cover to cover? And in a room of some 200 people, not one student raised their hand, including this student. Second question he asked was, how many of you believe America's a great country? This was more than 25 years ago. We all raised our hand. Then the speaker asked the question, how many of you have read the Constitution in its entirety? No one raised their hand. Then the last question he asked, apropos of this day, was how many of you believe Martin Luther King Jr. was a great man? And everyone raised their hand enthusiastically. Then he asked the question, how many of you have read all of his books? Shamefaced, I hung my head and resolved to read the Constitution in its entirety, read the Bible in its entirety, and read everything that Martin Luther King wrote. And over the course of the next 4 years, I dedicated myself to reading all of his sermons, all of his essays, all of his books, and it changed my life. When I began to read about King's philosophy of nonviolence, when I began to read his understanding of agape love, when I began to read his analysis of American racism, when I began to read not only his academic, sociological, theological, doctrinal depth, but when I began to plumb his spiritual depth, his prayer life. It got quiet in here. I, as a young man, began to appreciate that it's important for us to cultivate the life of the mind and the life of the heart. And so on this Martin Luther King Day, I want to encourage every child and every child of God to begin to read Dr. King seriously. It's good to quote Dr. King. We got a lot of people who do that. Quote and misquote. But this is a moment in which I would encourage on the holiday, read his sermons. Read the essay. Read the letter from a Birmingham jail. And what you'll find is the words are not merely pretty. The words are not merely poetic. The words are not merely rhapsodic. The words are incisive and penetrating and powerful and true. I don't have to tell you that. I'm in a place that represents a scholarly tradition. We understand that the first scholars, or certainly among the first scholars, were the priests, the prophets. We understand that Isaiah was represented as a prophet, a school of prophets who wrote in his name. Your rabbi is a scholar. He has a great sense of humor. He's warm. But those of us who pretend to be scholars, we know a scholar when we see one. As humble as they try to be, as comical as they try to be, you're in a place that appreciates analysis. And so as we teeter on the brink of authoritarianism and kleptocratic autocracy, this is a moment to read. This is a moment to study. This is a moment to gather your children around you and talk about current events. Study the history, because when we do that, we empower ourselves. This is a concept I teach my students at the Harvard Kennedy School called developing a hermeneutic of resilience. Hermeneutic, of course, is that phrase that rabbis and ministers and priests use. It's the science of interpretation. What happens when we read the newspaper, when we read our own history to empower ourselves? Well, let me not get to Torah. Let me get to your family history. When you read your family history in ways that empower your children, way before you got to be successful in this generation, go back a couple of generations. Tell the stories about your grandparents. Tell the stories about your great-grandparents. When you read those histories, they speak to your children. They empower your children. They give you a sense of identity and authority. You're not persuaded. You're not persuaded. Can I tell you something? if Harriet Tubman, you recall Harriet Tubman who led 70 people to freedom on the Underground Railroad? You recall Harriet Tubman, the first woman to lead American troops into battle in the low country of South Carolina during the Civil War, and she freed 750 people? You recall that Harriet Tubman was called the Moses of her people. If the Christians read your book, if the Christians read your story, if the Christians hear your family history and know how powerful it is, you should appreciate how powerful it is. The Christians, we can be rip-off artists. If you don't mind me saying, parenthetically, theologically, we all steal from one another, you know. Synagogues in America look a little different than the synagogues in Europe because we borrow from one another. Stained glass, and that kind of thing. We borrow, but, you know, architectural theft is one thing, but theological theft is something altogether different. I want to suggest to you that on this King holiday, this is a moment for serious analysis, serious thoughtfulness. Maybe let me share something else with you parenthetically. King was put on the road to being a serious intellectual by going to college at 15. How did he go to college at 15? What was the admissions program at Morehouse College that brought that into being? There was a president of Morehouse College by the name of Benjamin E. Mays. Benjamin Mays, who came from my home state of South Carolina, went to Bates College, was an academic superstar, went to the University of Chicago and got a PhD, and then became the president of Morehouse College. When he came to Morehouse College, as Hitler was ascending to power, when he came to Morehouse College, World War II broke out, and all the men were being drafted to fight authoritarianism, to fight Nazism, to fight hate and anti-Semitism and racism abroad, even as we ignored it at home. And Dr. Mays, with the men going off to college, starts an early admissions program for students at Morehouse. So were it not for World War II, and the dictators and the despots and the autocrats abroad, Martin Luther King might have not had the start he had. Our histories are intertwined. I know that's not a good thing to say these days. People get kind of anxious about that. They want to talk about the relationship between blacks and Jews as nostalgic, something that happened back in the day. Well, those of us who try to be literate with respect to history know that the history is yet unfolding. And so the first lesson of the text is, like the scouts, we need to appreciate the reports. But the second aspect of this text is we can't just read the reports or listen to the reports uncritically. Anybody read the New York Times, the LA Times, the Wall Street Journal, Haaretz, the Times of Israel, and find yourself depressed? I trust that only my remarks are being recorded and not your responses. But when we read the newspapers, when we listen to podcasts, it can bring about all but a clinical state of depression. And so here we are at Canaan's edge, like the Israelites on the edge of the promised land, and there are certain reports that come back. The report that comes back with respect to the demographic report, there are powerful people in the land. Not altogether surprising. And that the cities are well fortified, again, not altogether surprising. And that the land is dripping with milk and honey. Not surprising, because if you believe in God's promises, that's a confirmation of the promise, not a revelation with respect to the promise. But then the reports come back, and the text tells us that there's a bad report. Some of the scouts, and I know this is not true for this congregation, but you know, among the Christians, when we have a meeting, I know, the Jewish people have lots of opinions. The Christians, we may not be quite where you are, but we close. In every church meeting, there's somebody with the bad report. They want to remind you of what God can't do, what God can't do, and what God's people can't do with God. And so here we have the Israelites who get a bad report. The bad report says that the cities are fortified, that there are people in the land who are of giant stature, and Nephilim. These are people between 7 and 9 feet tall. I wish I had that kind of height. I wouldn't be a lawyer. I'd be in the NBA. And so the text tells us the report comes back, and the people are being discouraged prior to Caleb trying to silence these bad reports. I want to suggest to you, based upon the text and based upon the life and legacy, words and work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, we need to read the reports, read the news in the context of covenant. May I say that again? In the context of covenant. Why are you reading the newspapers, listening to podcasts without the context of your religious life in your synagogue? Again, I can tell somebody that went right over someone's head. If this was a class at Harvard, I'd repeat that. Why are we listening to the bad reports about the next 4 years, listening to the bad reports about the state of our democracy? Why are we listening to bad reports without the context of the covenant with God? So in other words, why are we listening to reports, reading reports, analysis about the state of the world without understanding the state of our God? You see, when you read the newspaper in the context of Torah, you read it differently. When you listen to a podcast in the context of God's promises, you hear it differently. So in other words, when you listen to CNN, MSNBC, CBS, ABC, or NPR, you should also be listening to it in the context of COVENANT, covenant. Because if we're all depressed, we can't be resilient. We can't resist. We can't protect our democracy. We can't protect our families. Again, somebody got lost. When we see all across the country, according to the FBI statistics, and certainly the statistics of the ADL, when we see a rising tide of anti-Semitism. I'm a civil rights lawyer. I pay attention to these things. And we see, when I say anti-Semitism, I'm talking about, yes, swastikas, desecrating houses of worship, but I'm also talking about elderly people being slapped. I'm talking about yarmulkes being taken off people's heads. I'm talking about people being disrespected on our streets. I'm talking about people being afraid on college campuses. I'm not talking about vigorous debate. I'm not talking about intellectual discussion of geopolitics. I'm talking about demonizing, dehumanizing, degrading, and demeaning people. God's people. You can't square that. And so when you see these statistics viciously vectoring upward, you have to ask yourself, how do we respond to that? You can't respond to it if all you do is lament about how bad things are. When you read Torah and you read about a people who are beset, now again, I'm not talking about militarism, but I'm talking about the degree to which God protects his people. When you read these statistics, you say there's something we can do about it. We can stand up. We can fight back. We can protect our community. And when I say community, I'm talking about the whole of the community. Why? Because when anti-Semitism rises against Jews, anti-black racism always high, but it goes high. Islamophobia rises. Homophobia rises. Again, I can tell this is not quite clear. May I share with you, when I was president and CEO of the NAACP, one day when I didn't have anything better to do in a 100-hour work week, I decided to read my fan mail, translated and transliterated, that would mean your hate mail. And here's what I found. What I found was there were no letters that manifested, exhibited anti-black racism that did also manifest and exhibit anti-Semitism. The people calling me the N-word had special words for Jews that were not complimentary. And so we can't fight anti-black racism without also fighting anti-Semitism. You're not protected unless you understand we're all mutually vulnerable. No, okay. Don't repeat this beyond the walls of the sanctuary. I'm going to just tell you something. Let me just confess. When anti-Semites whisper in my ear, I don't trust them. I know where they're coming from. You can be a white anti-Semite. You can be a black anti-Semite. You can be an anti-Semite of any ethnicity or heritage. But haters are haters. And so again, we come back to covenant. We come back to God's promise. When we read these reports, we have to read them in the context of what we're taught in synagogue and in church and in our temples. It's dangerous for God's people to engage in political work and activism and advocacy without God. Now, you know, I teach at the Kennedy School. This must be absolutely heresy. I live in the land of economists. But I get nervous when I hear God's people talking about, quoting the New York Times, quoting the Brennan Center and Vera and Cato or the Heritage Foundation. You choose and pick your think tank. But when you quote the reports or some reports and don't quote the report, I know that you're well informed, but you're not powerful. How is it? Because I teach advocacy at the Kennedy School, here's what I found. That people who don't believe in God love the way God's people organize. Because our meetings have power. I could barely understand all that was being sung and said, but I knew I was in the proximity of people with power. Rabbi, let me tell you something. There are people who wish they could bottle what you got. There are people who wish that they could bottle your resilience, your resolve, your determination, your power, your moral clarity, your prophetic vision. If the agnostics and the atheists appreciate what you have, why don't you appreciate more fully what you have? I'm just asking. Every time we have a meeting, we got people, and I'm not knocking people who are atheists or agnostic. Let me be clear. But here's what I know. People will come into our meetings, and they love the singing, love the prayers, they love our ceremony, they love the way we walk and we process, and we wear strange garments and vestments, and we nod our heads up and down, and they think it's all so exotic and behaviorally interesting. But the reality is, when the New York Times has persuaded you that there's nothing you can do, Torah convinces you there is something God can do and that you can do with God. So if there's anybody in the house who's not convinced that you're in a place of power, wake up! Let me give you another example. Martin Luther King, toward the end of his life, this is long after he won or was awarded the Nobel Prize, long after he was heralded and lauded in newspapers across the country. Toward the end of his life, he was incredibly unpopular, derided, and mocked in leading newspapers. And so his colleagues, his friends, worrying about the state of his mental health, encouraged him to take a vacation. He found himself taking a vacation near the Gulf of Mexico. And his friend, the Reverend Ralph David Abernathy, woke up in the middle of the night and Dr. King was nowhere to be found. And he wondered if his friend Martin Luther King had committed suicide. So, Reverend Abernathy looks high and low and he finds Dr. King standing on the balcony looking out over the Gulf of Mexico. And he asks Dr. King, Martin, what's wrong? What's wrong with you? Why are you up in the midnight hour? Dr. King simply pointed to a rock jutting above the waters, and he quoted the words of this famous hymn, Rock of Ages, cleft for me, oh, let me hide myself in thee. This reminds us of the words of the Bible. God is my rock and my refuge. What I'm sharing with you today is this place is where your power comes from. This book is where your power comes from. If you're reading more than you're praying, your priorities might be out of order. If you're analyzing far more than you're engaged in meditation, your spiritual priorities might be out of order. If you're shouting and tweeting and posting more than you are singing and praising and exalting, your priorities might be out of order. If you find your sustenance in anger outside of this house rather than the joy in this house, your priorities are out of order. And even more than that, you're probably weak. I'm a policy wonk. I'm closet. I try to keep it under wraps. Yeah. I'm kind of geeky. I married a woman who was much more popular than I was in college. Rabbi, since you was equal, you was lucky too. The rabbi smiled, but his wife smiled more. And one of the things that my wife knows about me is that there are times when I can obsess over ideas, obsess over analysis. Well, I want to share with you during this Martin Luther King Shabbat service, don't misread Dr. King. We tend to think of him as the intellectual. He was that. We think of him as an extraordinary preacher. He was that. We think of him as an incredible leader. He was that. But don't forget he was a prayer warrior. Don't forget that there were times when he leaned on God. You recall that famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech? You recall reading that? You recall hearing that? You know that wasn't supposed to happen, right? You recall that the Reverend Wyatt T. Walker was on stage with Martin Luther King and had already told Dr. King, do not preach that tired, trite, I have a dream speech. This is a day for policy and law. That must have been somebody channeling Cornell William Brooks. But then off to the side, there was a prayer warrior by the name of Mahalia Jackson. And as Dr. King got through his prepared, carefully scripted remarks, Mahalia Jackson, the extraordinary gospel singer, said, "Martin, tell him about the dream." And Dr. King acted like he was deaf. And she repeated what she said. And the rest is history. That was the voice of prayer. That was the voice of the Spirit. That was the voice of God over the next 4 years. If there's a neo-McCarthyism, there will be the voice of God whispering in your ear. If there's authoritarianism, if there are mass deportations, if racial discrimination and racial profiling is unleashed all across the land, there will be the voice of God whispering in your ear. Do not be afraid. Fear not. Do not fear the autocrat. The word says, I will fear no evil. I will fear no autocracy. I will fear no kleptocratic authoritarianism. I will fear no racism. I will fear no mass deportation. I will fear no anti-Semitism. I will fear no transphobia. I will fear no militarism. I will fear no one. We are God's people. The way you sang this morning tells me you got a God who's not afraid and who's trying to persuade you not to be afraid. And if by chance you're not convinced, I want to leave you with these words known well by Dr. King. The words would be these: lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on, let us march on, let us march on, let us march on till victory is won. Amen.
I was persuaded. My honor to invite Lisa Summers